They said the Alpha King of Ethgard had no heart left to beat. They said it had frozen over 10 years ago, buried beneath the brutal winters and the blood of his enemies. Darius was not a prince from the old songs. He was a warlord. He was violence made flesh. Below his unforgiving iron throne, the most powerful lords of the north knelt in trembling submission. It was the night of the mating ceremony, and they paraded their daughters before him, high-born women wrapped in expensive velvet, drowning in heavy, cloying perfumes. They bowed their heads. They bared their pale throats in absolute, desperate surrender. But as the Alpha King looked down at the sea of powdered flesh, he felt absolutely nothing but disgust. He smelled the sour stench of their cowardice. He heard the frantic, erratic thumping of their greedy hearts. In this entire vast kingdom, not a single soul possessed the spine to defy him. Until the suffocating silence broke. It wasn't the soft, calculated step of a noble lady. It was an Omega, a servant girl from the lowest caste, wearing rough, undyed linen. Her pale blonde hair was tangled, and her eyes were a milky, clouded gray. She was completely blind. When a massive royal guard violently kicked her cane away and raised a heavy hand to strike the helpless Omega, the entire court held its breath, waiting for her to break. But the blind girl did not cower. She didn't shed a single tear. She locked her trembling knees, grabbed her wooden cane from the floor, and stood perfectly straight. She tilted her chin up in sheer, unapologetic defiance and let her voice ring out like a hammer striking an anvil. "Keep your boots off my cane." Just one sentence, just one refusal to bow. The Alpha King went perfectly still. His predatory amber eyes locked onto the fragile, bruised girl who was harder than cold iron. For the first time in a decade, the ancient primal wolf inside his chest roared with a violent, territorial possessiveness. Surrounded by hundreds of sycophants who were terrified of him, no one could change the frozen heart of the Alpha King, except the blind girl who refused to see him as a monster. "Hold," Darius commanded. The word was not shouted. It was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. The royal guard froze instantly, his massive hands suspended in mid-air, inches from Rowan's face. The entire hall seemed to stop breathing. The nobles, dripping in their expensive silks and heavy perfumes, pressed themselves back against the stone walls, desperate to escape the Alpha King's sudden, suffocating aura. Darius stood up from the iron throne. He didn't look at the high-born ladies who had spent hours painting their faces for him. His eyes were locked entirely on the girl in the rough linen tunic. He walked down the steps of the dais, his heavy, armor-clad boots thudding against the stone in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Rowan heard him coming. Her clouded gray eyes stared blankly ahead, but her heightened senses tracked his approach perfectly. She heard the displacement of air. She smelled the sharp, overwhelming scent of ozone, cold iron, and old blood. He stopped a mere 2 paces from her. The heat radiating off his massive frame washed over her fragile body. "You are an Omega," Darius said softly, his voice testing the waters. Rowan gripped the smooth wood of her cane. Her knuckles turned white, but her voice did not shake. "I am. You struck one of my guards." "He kicked me," she stated simply, "and he stepped on my property. I removed his boot." A collective gasp echoed through the court. Lord Corwin, the wealthiest man in the north, looked as though he might faint. No one spoke to the king with such cold, factual indifference. You spoke with reverence. You spoke with submission. Darius tilted his head. Beneath the suffocating stench of the noble's rosewater and musk, a new scent hit him. It was incredibly faint, masked by the smell of lye soap on her cheap clothes, but to his wolf it was like a strike of lightning. Wood smoke, pine needles, cold earth, and beneath it all, the bright metallic tang of pure, unadulterated fury. She smelled like anger. There was not a single drop of fear in her veins. "You do not lower your head to your alpha," Darius observed, taking one final step into her personal space, daring her to retreat. Rowan didn't step back. She tilted her chin up just a fraction higher, exposing the delicate, pale line of her throat. "I am blind, Your Grace," Rowan replied, her tone dripping with a subtle, bitter sarcasm. "Looking at the floor offers me no different a view than looking at the ceiling. Why strain my neck?" The silence in the great hall was absolute. Hundreds of eyes were locked on the massive Alpha King and the fragile, blind girl standing fearlessly in his shadow. Rowan held her iron-tipped cane tightly. She fully expected the monster of the north to strike her. She had heard the stories. She knew what Darius did to those who defied him. But she refused to beg. If she was going to die tonight, she would die standing. Darius stared down at the delicate column of her exposed throat. He looked at the heavy bruise already darkening on her pale cheekbone where the guard had struck her. He inhaled deeply, pulling her scent into his lungs. There was no terror, only the cold, sharp scent of pine, earth, and an unbreakable will. The ancient beast inside his chest, dormant and cynical for a decade, clawed at his ribs. Mine. The instinct was absolute. "A blind Omega," Lord Corwin sneered, his voice shattering the fragile quiet. He stepped out of the crowd, his face flushed dark with insult. "Your Grace, this is madness. She is defective, a broken lower caste thing. My daughter Genevieve is a purebred." "Silence!" Darius didn't shout. He didn't roar. But the single word slammed into the room like a physical blow. The ambient temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. The oppressive weight of his alpha aura flooded the space, forcing heads to lower and shoulders to hunch. Darius turned his predatory amber eyes slowly toward Corwin. "The ceremony is over." Corwin choked, practically vibrating with greedy outrage. "My king, you cannot mean this. She is a servant. Claiming her is an insult to the high-born lines of Ethgard. The neighboring packs will laugh us out of the north." Darius shifted his weight, stepping deliberately in front of Rowan, effectively shielding her small frame with his massive body. "Let them laugh," Darius replied, his voice a flat, dead calm that should have warned the older lord to stop. "I will mount their laughing heads on spikes outside them," he gaped. "As for you, Corwin, she is the only person in this hall who possesses a spine. I am looking for an alpha queen, not a trembling sacrificial lamb." Darius raised his voice, letting it echo off the vaulted stone ceilings. "I have found my mate." Gasps ripped through the crowd. Lady Genevieve covered her mouth, stepping back in horror. Rowan's fingers tightened around the smooth wood of her cane until her joints ached. Her heightened hearing picked up the sheer, venomous hatred spiking in the rapid heartbeats of the nobility around her. They didn't just resent her, they wanted her dead. "Guards, Darius commanded, his eyes sweeping over the cowering lords. "Clear the hall. If Lord Corwin speaks another word of disrespect toward his future queen, cut his tongue out and strip him of his lands." Panic erupted. The orderly lines dissolved into a chaotic rush as the nobility scrambled for the massive oak doors, desperate to escape the Alpha's wrath. In the center of the emptying hall, Darius turned back to Rowan. The suffocating pressure of his aura vanished, replaced by a strange, heavy stillness. "Come with me," he said. He did not grab her arm. He did not attempt to pick her up, though he could have carried her with one hand. He waited. Rowan listened to the fading footsteps of the court. She tapped her cane against the floor once, feeling for the edge of the stone steps, and began to walk. Darius matched her slow pace perfectly, his heavy boots thudding beside her, acting as a physical shield against the remaining guards. The journey to the royal wing was long and quiet. For 22 years, Rowan's life had been a symphony of noise: the cramped servants' quarters, the clatter of pots, the endless gossip. But here, the stone walls were 4 feet thick. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like a tomb. They stepped into the king's private solar, and the heavy, iron-banded door clicked shut behind them. The sound echoed with a terrifying finality. Rowan stood perfectly still. She catalogued the new environment through the soles of her boots and the air against her skin. The floor wasn't freezing stone anymore. It was covered in thick, dense pelts. The air was suffocatingly warm, heated by a massive hearth fire. And everywhere she smelled him: ozone, cold iron, and burning cedar. She was locked in the epicenter of the Predator's den. "Sit," Darius said. His voice came from the far side of the room. He hadn't made a sound crossing the floor. "I prefer to stand," Rowan replied, her chin tipping up defensively. She heard a heavy sigh escape his chest. It wasn't an angry sound. It sounded exhausted. "It wasn't a command, Rowan. There is a velvet chair 2 paces to your left. Sit before your knees give out." She hesitated, then shifted her cane, tapping the floor twice. The wood connected with the solid leg of a chair. She carefully lowered herself into it. The unforgivingly soft cushions felt entirely wrong beneath her itchy linen tunic. Darius walked back over to her. The heat radiating off his massive frame washed over her face. He knelt on the thick rug right in front of her. The movement was so smooth, so sudden. Rowan tensed, gripping her cane. "You have a bruise forming," he murmured. "I've had worse," she shot back, her voice tight. "Why did you do this?" "Do what?" Rowan turned her face toward the sound of his voice. Her clouded eyes stared blankly in his direction. "I am a blind Omega. I own nothing but this wooden stick. I cannot command a battlefield. I cannot even look you in the eye. You humiliated the most powerful families in the north to claim a broken servant. Why?" Darius reached out. He didn't touch her, but his hand hovered near her cheek, his warmth seeping into her skin. "They offered me their necks," Darius said quietly. "You offered me your teeth." Rowan frowned. "That is a death wish, not a political strategy." "It is the truth," Darius corrected, his tone darkening. "Everyone around me smiles to my face and plots to stab me in the back. But you will never smile at me unless you mean it. Tomorrow the lords will demand an explanation. They will try to tear you down because they think it will hurt me." Rowan swallowed hard. her grip on the cane slipping just a fraction. Then let me go. Send me back to the kitchens. Pretend it was a mad whim. Never. The word was absolute, a vow forged in iron. You are mine now, and I swear to you, if any lord or lady looks at you with disrespect, I will blind them myself. Rowan felt a cold shudder run down her spine. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was the obsession of a monster, and the real war hadn't even begun. The royal wing of Ethgard was too quiet. For 22 years, Rowan's life had been defined by the chaotic noise of the servants' quarters, the scrape of cast-iron pots, the crying of children, the endless, frantic shuffling of boots. You learned to map a room by the squeak of the floorboards. Here, the stone walls were 4 feet thick. The heavy velvet curtains muffled even the howling wind outside. It wasn't peaceful. To a blind girl relying on echolocation and ambient sound, it felt like being trapped in a velvet coffin. Rowan stood near the heavy oak desk in Darius's solar, her fingers gripping the silver handle of the new cane the King's Guard had forced upon her that morning. It was solid black oak, heavy and lethal. She ran her thumb over the snarling wolf's head carved into the pommel. The heavy metal hinges of the solar door groaned. There was no knock. Rowan didn't turn her head. She smelled him before he even crossed the threshold, cold iron, pine, and the coppery tang of the training yards. Darius walked with a distinctive, ground-eating stride, his heavy boots thudding against the thick rugs. He walked directly to the desk and dropped something massive onto it. It landed with a dull, solid thud that vibrated up through the soles of Rowan's boots. "Touch it," Darius commanded. His voice was low, carrying that same effortless authority. Rowan hesitated. She hated reaching into the unknown. But she lifted her left hand, slowly extending her fingers until they brushed against cold metal, then found a large, flat surface made of dense, polished wood. She traced the edges. It was a massive board, intricately carved with deep grooves and raised wooden blocks. "What is this?" she asked, her brow furrowing as her thumbs mapped a series of raised squares. "Ethgard," Darius said. He pulled up a chair and sat heavily beside her, the leather creaking under his massive frame. "I had the master carpenter carve it from the military siege maps overnight. Every corridor, every stairwell, every doorway in the keep." Rowan's hand stilled. She felt a sudden, sharp lump form in her throat. She swallowed it down, forcing her voice to remain flat. "Why?" "Because you are blind, Rowan, not helpless." Darius's tone was entirely matter-of-fact, lacking any trace of pity. "If my enemies come for you, they won't challenge you in the courtyard at high noon. They are cowards. They will use the dark. They will try to corner you in the keep. I cannot be by your side every second of the day, and I refuse to lock my queen in a tower with a dozen guards." He leaned closer. The heat of his body washed over her arm. "You need to know the terrain better than they do." Rowan traced a long groove on the board, her mind already highly trained to memorize physical space through trial and error, absorbing the tactile information hungrily. It was brilliant. It was practical. It was the most empowering thing anyone had ever done for her. "The Great Hall," Darius said, his deep voice guiding her. He didn't touch her hand to move it. He respected her space. "2 paces left of your current position. Follow the channel." Rowan moved her fingers. "The western corridor, 50 paces long," she deduced, feeling the tiny notches carved into the side. "3 doors on the right, 2 on the left." Exactly, Darius murmured. He leaned back, watching her clouded eyes dart back and forth as her brain translated the wood into architecture. I am building a fortress around you, Rowan, but you must know how to navigate it. Rowan dropped her hand from the board and turned her face toward him. The defensive hunch she had carried her entire life, the invisible weight of the Omega caste, was completely gone. You are securing your borders, Rowan said quietly. But you are forgetting something, King Darius. I have a weapon they do not. Your cane? He asked, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. My ears, Rowan corrected. She gripped the black oak cane tighter. I cannot see their faces. I cannot see their velvet dresses or their practiced curtsies. But I can hear their hearts. Darius went perfectly still. Wolves cannot hide their heartbeats, Rowan continued, her voice turning to cold steel. When Lord Corwin smiled and offered his daughter to you last night, his heart was hammering with furious, greedy thumps. When they lie, their pulse spikes. I hear the shift in their breathing. I smell the sour spike of their sweat before they even open their mouths. They think I am weak because I live in the dark, but the dark is where the truth hides. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Rowan listened to the steady, unshakable rhythm of the Alpha King's heart. It was slow, calm, and terrifyingly powerful. Then, a low, dark chuckle vibrated from Darius's chest. It was a sound of pure, predatory approval. They have absolutely no idea what I have brought into my court, Darius whispered, his voice thick with dangerous anticipation. He stood up, the leather of his armor shifting. Memorize the map, little Omega. Every stone, every corner, because tonight is the Solstice banquet. We dine with the wolves, and they are hungry for your blood. The heavy wool of the midnight blue dress felt entirely foreign against Rowan's skin. For her entire life, she had worn rough, itchy linen. Now, she was draped in the wealth of a kingdom. Yet, as she walked down the long, drafty western corridor of the keep, she didn't feel like a queen. She felt like a target painted in expensive colors. 3 paces to the next archway, Darius murmured, his heavy boots falling in sync with her slower steps. He walked half a step behind her and slightly to her right, acting as a massive, armored shadow. He was letting her lead. He was letting her count the paces and map the corridor, just as she had memorized from the wooden board earlier that day. Rowan tapped her black oak cane. The silver wolf's head on the pommel was cold against her palm. Clack, clack, clack. Suddenly, her heightened senses picked up an anomaly. She stopped. 10 paces ahead, the ambient airflow shifted, blocked by someone standing perfectly still in the center of the hall. Then the smell hit her. It was a suffocating wave of heavy rosewater and crushed musk, desperately trying to mask the sour, bitter stench of sheer jealousy. "Lady Genevieve," Rowan said smoothly, her clouded eyes staring straight ahead. She heard a sharp intake of breath. Genevieve, daughter of Lord Corwin, had thought herself perfectly hidden in the shadows of the archway. "You have sharp ears for an Omega," Genevieve sneered, her silk skirts rustling as she finally stepped forward. She completely ignored Darius, a calculated insult masked as an oversight. "I suppose when the moon goddess curses you with broken eyes, she has to give you something to survive the kitchens." Darius's aura flared violently behind Rowan, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the air in the corridor taste like ozone and copper. He was going to end the woman. But Rowan reached her left hand back, her fingertips brushing lightly against the heavy leather of Darius's sword belt. "Wait," the gesture said. Darius went perfectly still, letting his mate handle the hunt. "Did you intercept us in this freezing corridor just to discuss my ears, Lady Genevieve?" Rowan asked. She didn't sound angry, she sounded bored. Genevieve took a step closer. "I came to offer you a warning, servant. The king may have draped you in expensive wool to play a game, but a silk dress does not make a street dog a wolf. Tonight is the Solstice banquet. The High Lords will eat you alive. You do not belong at the high table. You will embarrass him, and then he will discard you." Rowan listened. She let the noblewoman's venomous words echo off the stone walls and fade into silence. Then Rowan took a slow step forward. Her cane struck the stone floor with a sharp, echoing crack. "Your words are very brave, Lady Genevieve," Rowan said, her voice dropping to a quiet, icy register. "But your body is betraying you." Genevieve faltered, her silk dress rustling as she shifted her weight. "What are you talking about?" Rowan took another step, invading Genevieve's personal space, using her cane to measure the exact distance. "I am talking about your heart. It is beating like a trapped bird against your ribs. Thump, thump, thump. So fast, so erratic." Genevieve took a step back. "I am not." "And your breathing," Rowan interrupted smoothly, taking another step, forcing the high-born lady to retreat again. "It is shallow, tight. You are terrified. You reek of rosewater, but underneath it you smell exactly like fear." Rowan stopped, tilting her head slightly, her dead gray eyes aimed perfectly at Genevieve's face. "You did not come here to warn me," Rowan stated, her voice slicing through the cold air like a blade. "You came here because last night the Alpha King looked at your beautiful face, smelled your desperation, and chose a blind servant over you. You are terrified because you realize that if I can command the Alpha King in the dark, your painted face and purebred title are absolutely worthless." A choked, humiliating sound escaped Genevieve's throat. She looked past Rowan, finally meeting Darius's eyes. The Alpha King was not angry. He was standing with his arms crossed over his massive chest, a dark, terrifying smirk playing on his scarred lips. He was enjoying the slaw. "Lighter." Genevieve gathered her skirts, turned on her heel, and practically fled down the corridor, the frantic patter of her expensive slippers echoing into the distance. Rowan stood perfectly still, taking a slow breath. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but she locked her knees. Darius stepped up beside her. He reached down, his calloused fingers gently covering her hand on the silver pommel of the cane, steadying her. "A street dog," Darius murmured, his voice rumbling with deep amusement. She forgot that street dogs know exactly how to bite the throat. "Are we at the doors?" Rowan asked, her voice steadying. "We are," Darius said. Rowan heard the muffled roar of conversation, the clatter of silver plates, and the crackle of massive hearths coming from the other side of the heavy oak doors. Hundreds of nobles, hundreds of liars. "Then open them," Rowan said, squaring her shoulders. "Let us feed the wolves." The heavy oak doors swung open, and the noise of the winter solstice banquet hit Rowan like a physical wall. It was a chaotic symphony of grinding glass, the clatter of silver plates, and the heavy, overlapping scents of roasted venison, spiced wine, and deceit. Rowan kept her face a blank, icy mask. She walked beside Darius, letting the steady rhythm of his heavy boots and the occasional tap of her black oak cane guide her to the dais. She sat rigidly in the iron chair beside the king. The metal was unforgiving, forcing her to keep her spine perfectly straight. For the first hour, the nobility approached the high table one by one to pay their respects. They offered hollow congratulations, their voices dripping with fake warmth, while their heartbeats hammered with resentment and fear. Rowan listened to every lie, cataloging the traitors in her mind. "Lord Gideon of the Eastern Reach," the herald announced. Rowan tilted her head slightly. She heard the soft, deliberate scuff of expensive velvet slippers. Gideon walked like a cat, completely silent compared to the heavy tread of the northern warriors. He stopped at the base of the dais. He smelled of cloves, aged plum wine, and something else, something sharp and acidic that made the back of Rowan's throat itch. "My king." Gideon's voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with an aristocratic drawl. "My deepest congratulations. The realm rejoices at the finding of your mate." Liar, Rowan thought. His heartbeat was a steady, calculated thump, but there was a faint, nervous flutter beneath it. "Gideon," Darius acknowledged, his tone flat. He didn't offer a hand or a smile. "I hear the eastern passes are choked with snow. I am surprised you made the journey." "I would not miss the opportunity to pledge my loyalty to our new queen," Gideon replied smoothly. He took a step closer to the dais. "I brought a gift." Rowan heard the quiet slosh of liquid, the clink of silver against stone. "A rare vintage from my private cellars in the Reach," Gideon continued, his voice projecting so the entire silent hall could hear. "Blessed by the moon priests for fertility and strength. I ask that the queen do me the honor of a toast." A servant stepped up to the dais, holding a silver tray with a single ornate goblet. Rowan didn't move. As the goblet came closer, the scent of the plum wine intensified, but so did the acidic undercurrent. It smelled like crushed almonds mixed with bitter ash. Wolfsbane. It wasn't enough to kill a massive alpha like Darius outright, but for a fragile, human-sized omega like Rowan, a single sip would stop her heart in minutes. Gideon was testing her. If she refused the drink without cause, she insulted a high lord in front of the entire court, making herself look like a paranoid, ungracious peasant. If she drank it, she died, and Darius would have to butcher a lord at a peace summit, sparking a civil war. "Drink with me, Your Grace," Gideon urged, his voice practically purring. Beside her, Darius shifted his weight. Rowan heard the heavy leather of his sword belt creak. The king's aura flared, a suffocating, violent pressure filling the space between them. He smelled the poison. He was going to intervene. He was going to decapitate Gideon right here on the steps. "Wait," Rowan whispered, just loud enough for Darius to hear. She reached her left hand out blindly. Her fingers brushed the edge of the silver tray, then found the cool metal stem of the goblet. The great hall had gone deathly quiet. Hundreds of eyes were locked on the blind Omega. "A toast," Rowan said, her voice clear, carrying over the crackle of the hearths. "To the loyalty of the Eastern Reach." Gideon smiled. She could hear the smugness in his breathing. "To the Queen." Rowan brought the goblet to her lips. The smell of the Wolfsbane was overpowering now, burning her nasal passages. She didn't tip the cup. She let it hover a millimeter from her mouth for a long, agonizing second. Then she lowered it. "It is a fascinating vintage, Lord Gideon. Rowan said casually. She turned her clouded eyes perfectly in his direction. "Plum, I believe, harvested late in the season." "Indeed, Your Grace." Gideon's heartbeat picked up a fraction of a beat, a tiny flutter of uncertainty. "And yet," Rowan continued, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unbreakable ice, "I find the bouquet lacking. It smells heavily of bitter leaf, the root specifically, crushed into a fine powder." The ambient noise in the banquet hall died instantly. Total, horrifying silence fell over the room. Bitterleaf was the common name for Wolfsbane. Gideon's heartbeat spiked. It hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. I do not know what you mean, Your Grace." "It is pure wine, is it?" Rowan stood up. Her bruised ribs screamed in protest, but she locked her knees and stood perfectly straight, and she held the silver goblet out toward him. "In the lower castes, Lord Gideon, we have a tradition. The one who pours the drink takes the first swallow to prove their good faith." She took a slow step forward, right to the edge of the dais. "Drink it." Gideon stared at the silver cup as if it were a loaded crossbow. Sweat broke out on his forehead. The scent of his fear exploded in the air, sour, sharp, and pathetic. "My queen, I would not presume to drink from the royal cup." "I said drink it," Rowan commanded. It wasn't an alpha's roar. It was worse. It was the absolute, unyielding coldness of someone who held his life in her hands and felt nothing but contempt. Gideon took a step back, his velvet slippers scraping desperately against the stone. He looked past Rowan to Darius, silently begging for the Alpha King to intervene, to save him from the Omega's judgment. Darius was sitting back in his iron chair, his arms crossed over his massive chest. A terrifying, predatory grin stretched across his scarred face. He wasn't going to save Gideon. He was watching his mate hunt. I cannot," Gideon choked out. He fell heavily to his knees, his expensive velvet robes pooling around him on the floor. "Mercy, have mercy." Rowan stared down at the groveling lord, the man who had just tried to murder her in front of 100 witnesses. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I am an Omega, Lord Gideon," Rowan said. She tipped her wrist. The poisoned wine spilled over the edge of the goblet, splashing directly onto the cold stone floor, mere inches from Gideon's trembling hands. The liquid hissed faintly, eating away at the mortar. "I do not deal in mercy," she whispered. She turned her back on him and walked back to her chair, her cane tapping a steady, terrifying rhythm. As she sat down, Darius leaned over, his breath hot against her ear. "Guards," the Alpha King called out, his eyes locked proudly on his blind queen. "Take Lord Gideon to the dungeons, and fetch the executioner." The court erupted into panicked whispers as armored guards dragged the screaming lord away. Rowan gripped her cane, her heart beating fast but steady. She had won the psychological war. But outside the thick glass windows of the great hall, a massive crack of thunder shook the keep. The winter storm had finally broken, and the real wolves were about to breach the gates. The execution of Lord Gideon cast a grim, heavy shadow over the rest of the Solstice banquet. No one else dared to speak out of turn. When Darius finally stood and led Rowan out of the great hall, the nobility bowed their heads in terrified silence, parting like the sea before them. The moment the heavy oak doors of the royal solar clicked shut behind them, the winter storm outside violently intensified. Rain lashed against the thick glass windows, and thunder vibrated through the floorboards. Rowan walked toward the hearth, the heat of the fire sinking into the heavy wool of her dress. She was exhausted. The adrenaline of outsmarting Gideon was fading, leaving a dull, rhythmic ache in her bound ribs. Before Darius could even remove his heavy sword belt, a violent crash echoed from the corridor outside. The heavy metal hinges of the solar door shrieked. The door blasted open, shattering the lock inward. Rowan spun around, gripping her black oak cane with both hands. Darius didn't flinch, but his hand dropped instantly to the hilt of his broadsword. A massive figure stood in the threshold, breathing like a hunted animal. Mud caked his heavy leather riding boots, and freezing rain dripped from his chainmail armor, pooling on the polished stone floor. His broadsword was already drawn, the steel catching the flickering light of the hearth. It was a vanguard beta, a front-line soldier who had ridden 3 days straight through the freezing passes without sleep. He locked eyes with Darius. "Where is she?" he snarled, his voice raw and shredded by the wind. "If you touched her, king or not, I will cut your throat." 2 royal guards rushed up behind the rogue beta, their halberds lowered, ready to execute him on the spot for treason. Darius raised a single calloused hand. The gesture was casual, but the guards froze instantly, stepping back into the corridor. Darius did not draw his sword. He looked at the frantic soldier with a cold, analytical calmness. "If I wanted to hurt her, Vanguard," Darius said smoothly, his voice rumbling over the sound of the rain, "you would not be standing here breathing my air. Put the sword away." "Keon." The soft voice drifted from the hearth. Keon whirled around, the broadsword in his hand dipped slightly. Rowan stepped forward into the firelight. She was completely unrecognizable to him. The itchy, gray servant's linen was gone, replaced by a dress of deep, midnight blue wool tailored to fit her perfectly. Her pale hair was brushed and braided cleanly back from her face. She held a heavy black oak cane, her chin tilted slightly as she listened to the erratic, frantic thumping of her brother's heart. "Rowan," Keon choked out. He slammed his sword into its scabbard and crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He dropped to his knees in front of her, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in the heavy wool of her dress. He was shaking. "Gods, Ro," Keon whispered, his fingers digging into the fabric. "When the runner reached my camp, when they said the king claimed a blind Omega from the kitchens, I thought you were a hostage. I thought you were dead." Rowan dropped her cane. It clattered loudly against the floor. She ran her hands over her brother's wet hair, feeling the cold, heavy chainmail on his shoulders. Her clouded eyes burned with a rare, stinging heat. "I am here, Keon," she whispered fiercely. "I am safe." Keon pulled back, gripping her shoulders to inspect her. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her cheekbone, and his eyes snapped back to Darius, blazing with hatred. "Why?" Keon demanded, standing up to face the king. "She is an Omega. She cannot give you an Alpha heir." "What kind of sick game is this?" Darius stepped forward, towering over the beta. But the Alpha King held back his suffocating aura, a deliberate, shocking sign of respect. "No game," Darius replied. "She is my mate, and you are here to take command of my personal guard." Keon blinked, stunned. "You expect me to serve you after you dragged my sister into this snake pit?" "I expect you to serve her," Darius corrected, his amber eyes narrowing. Lord Gideon tried to poison her tonight. The remaining lords are terrified, which makes them dangerous. They are cowards, Kion. They won't challenge me in the courtyard. They will send knives in the dark. I need a man on the door who cannot be bought with gold or titles. Kion looked past the king and saw the massive wooden board resting on the oak desk. He recognized the intricate grooves immediately, a siege map. He looked at Rowan, realizing what the king had done. The Alpha hadn't locked his sister in a cage. He had handed the blind girl the architectural layout of the castle. "They won't stop," Kion said, his voice dropping into a grim soldier's register. "If Gideon failed with poison, the others will resort to steel." "I know," Darius murmured, stepping closer to Rowan. The possessive affection in his gaze was a jarring contrast to his violent scars. "Let them come. We are done playing politics." Outside, another heavy crack of thunder shook the stone walls. Rowan bent down and picked up her cane. As she straightened, she tilted her head, her brow furrowed. Underneath the scent of the wet earth, the ozone, and her brother's damp armor, her heightened senses caught something completely foreign. The sharp, metallic tang of cold iron, and a dry, bitter smell creeping under the doorframe. Ash. "Kion!" Rowan said sharply, the warmth of the reunion vanishing from her voice in an instant. "Lock the door." Before Kion could move, the torches lining the corridor outside were extinguished simultaneously. It wasn't a flicker. It was a coordinated smothering. A heavy, acrid cloud of gray smoke suddenly billowed from the chimney, hissing violently as it hit the hearth fire, killing the flames. Plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, the solar became a tomb. The darkness in the solar was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. "Wolfsbane smoke!" Kion shouted, his voice immediately breaking into a harsh, rattling sea. It was a brilliant, cowardly tactic. The smoke billowing from the extinguished hearth wasn't concentrated enough to kill an alpha or a beta outright, but it severely compromised their two greatest assets. The thick, acrid ash burned their eyes, blinding them in the pitch-black room, and the overwhelming, bitter scent of the crushed root completely destroyed their sense of smell. The assassins had masked their own sense with ash and blinded the wolves in a single, coordinated move. Before the smoke could fully settle, the massive stained glass window at the far end of the solar shattered inward. A violent gust of freezing wind and rain roared into the room, scattering shards of glass across the thick pelts on the floor. 4 figures poured through the broken frame, rappelling down from the roof of the keep. They wore dark leather and carried no torches, moving with lethal, practiced silence. They didn't speak. They didn't growl. They simply moved for the kill in the dark. Darius roared. The sound was a physical force, vibrating the loose glass on the floorboards. The Alpha King drew his broadsword, the heavy steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. He swung violently toward the window, his blade connecting with something solid. A man grunted in pain, stumbling backward into the storm. But there were 3 left, and Darius was fighting completely blind in a room full of toxic smoke. Okay. A blade sliced through the air, catching the heavy leather of Darius's armor. He shifted, swinging again, but the assassin had already ducked away, using the cover of the Wolfsbane cloud. "I can't see them!" Kion yelled, violently as his sword clashed wildly against a hidden attacker's dagger somewhere near the center of the room. "Darius, hold your swing! I don't know where you are!" Rowan stood perfectly still near the heavy oak desk. The smoke burned her lungs, making her eyes water, but the darkness meant absolutely nothing to her. She had lived in it for 22 years. While the terrifying Alpha King and the battle-hardened Vanguard Beta thrashed blindly against the unknown, Rowan's mind snapped to the carved wooden board she had mapped with her fingers just hours ago. She didn't just know this room, she owned it. She closed her eyes, a useless reflex, and opened her ears. The chaos of the storm outside was loud, but inside the room, the auditory landscape was painfully clear to her. She heard Keon's heavy, armored boots scraping on the stone floor to her right. She heard the massive, solid thuds of Darius's stance near the shattered window. And then she heard the anomalies. The soft, deliberate scuff of soft leather soles on the fur rug. The faint, metallic whisper of chainmail hidden under cloaks. The rapid, focused heartbeats of 3 men who thought they controlled the room. One by the door, one circling Keon, one moving left, slipping into the king's blind spot. "Keon!" Rowan yelled, her voice cutting through the sounds of the storm, sharp and authoritative. "2 paces to your left! Swing low!" Keon didn't hesitate. He trusted his sister's voice more than his own compromised instincts. He lunged 2 paces left and swept his heavy broadsword in a low, brutal arc. A sickening crunch echoed through the room as the steel connected with the assassin's legs. The man went down, howling in agony, his dagger clattering harmlessly away across the stone floor. Keon brought the hilt of his sword down heavily, silencing the threat. "Rowan, stay down," Darius commanded, his breathing heavy as he tracked the origin of her voice, trying to position himself between her and the remaining killers. But Rowan didn't crouch. She stood tall, gripping her black oak cane, her head tilting sharply toward the sound of the assassin creeping along the western wall. The man was moving carefully, avoiding the debris, trying to flank the Alpha King. "I am fine," Rowan said, her voice unnervingly calm. "They are in my world now." She tracked the faint scrape of the assassin's boots. The man had stopped. He wasn't drawing a sword. Rowan heard a very specific, mechanical sound. The creak of wood bending under extreme tension. The heavy click of an iron bolt locking into place. A crossbow. And the weapon was aimed directly at the sound of the Alpha King's heavy breathing. Rowan had a fraction of a second. She knew the distance. She knew the angle. "Darius, drop!" Rowan screamed. Darius did not hesitate. He did not question her, and he did not let his alpha pride demand an explanation. At the exact sound of her scream, the massive king dropped instantly to one knee, letting his heavy broadsword hit the floor to anchor his weight. Less than a heartbeat later, a heavy iron crossbow bolt ripped through the empty space where Darius's chest had been. The violent force of the projectile displaced the smoke as it flew past him, burying itself deep into the thick wood of the oak desk with a sickening final thud. Rowan's breath hitched, but she didn't freeze. The layout of the room, carved into that wooden board, burned brightly in her mind. She knew exactly where the shot had come from. The heavy tapestry along the western wall. "He is reloading!" Rowan shouted, her voice ringing out like a battlefield commander's. "Darius! 2 paces forward, 1 pace right! Strike at chest height!" Darius moved with terrifying, explosive speed. Guided entirely by the voice of his blind mate, the Alpha King lunged forward in the pitch-black room. He didn't need his eyes, and he didn't need his compromised scent. He only needed her. He swung his broadsword in a brutal horizontal arc exactly where she had directed. The heavy steel found its mark. The crossbow splintered into pieces, followed by a choked gasp as the assassin was thrown backward against the stone wall. The man slid to the floor, completely neutralized. 2 down, 2 left. "Keon, hold your ground," Rowan ordered, listening to her brother's frantic shuffling near the door. "Do not swing. You will hit Darius." Silence crashed back into the room, save for the howling winter storm outside and the ragged breathing of the wolves. The Wolfsbane smoke was beginning to thin, pulled out through the shattered window, but the room remained cloaked in impenetrable darkness. Rowan adjusted her grip on her black oak cane. She closed her eyes again, tuning out the harsh rasp of Darius's lungs and focusing entirely on the ambient sound. "Where are you?" she thought. Then she heard it. The faint, almost imperceptible scrape of leather against stone. Not on the heavy fur rugs, but near the edges of the room. The third assassin had retreated, realizing the sheer, terrifying disadvantage of fighting an Alpha King who had a radar in the dark. Suddenly, a heavy, armored body crashed into a wooden chair near the center of the room. "Ah!" Keon grunted, the sound of a struggle erupting. The third assassin had thrown a chair as a distraction, forcing Keon to engage with the empty air while the killer slipped past him. But Rowan wasn't fooled by the distraction. She heard the real threat. She heard the soft, rapid footfalls rushing straight toward her. The final assassin, the leader of the strike team, had realized a fatal Ruth. The threat in this room wasn't the hulking Alpha King or the Vanguard Beta. The true threat was the blind girl giving the orders. If he silenced her, the wolves would be blind again, and the king would fall. Rowan smelled the ash on his clothes, cutting through the bitter Wolfsbane smoke. He was moving fast, too fast for Darius to intercept from the other side of the room. "Darius, left!" Keon shouted, completely disoriented in the dark, trying to warn his king. But Darius was too far away. "Rowan!" The Alpha King roared, a sound of pure, helpless terror ripping from his throat as he realized what was happening. He thrashed blindly toward the sound of her voice, his heavy boots destroying furniture in his path. He wasn't going to make it in time. Rowan stood completely alone by the heavy oak desk. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She planted her feet firmly on the stone floor. She calculated the distance by the sound of the assassin's boots. 4 paces. 3. 2. As the assassin lunged, raising a serrated dagger to gut her, Rowan dropped her center of gravity, slipping perfectly to the side. She did not flinch. She did not scream. She let the assassin's own violent momentum carry him forward into the empty space where she had just been standing. In the exact same fraction of a second, Rowan whipped her black oak cane upward with both hands. She put every ounce of her meager strength and all the leverage of her survival instinct into the swing. The heavy, iron-shod tip of the walking stick caught the assassin squarely under the jaw. The force of the strike, combined with the man's terrifying forward momentum, produced a sickening crack that echoed through the room like a breaking tree branch. The assassin's neck snapped instantly. His body jerked backward, his weapon flying harmlessly from his grip, before he collapsed heavily onto the stone floor in a lifeless, twisted heap. The dagger clattered across the room, spinning to a halt near the hearth. Then, absolute silence slammed back into the solar. The only sound left was the relentless howling of the wind and the heavy, ragged breathing of the wolves. Slowly, the draft from the shattered window pulled the last of the Wolfsbane smoke out into the storm. A brilliant, jagged flash of lightning tore across the sky outside, illuminating the carnage in the royal chamber for a split second. Keon leaned heavily against the wall near the door, clutching a shallow cut on his ribs, staring at the center of the room in absolute awe. Rowan stood over the man she had just killed. Her chest heaved. Her hands were gripping the black oak cane so tightly that her knuckles were stark white. She had never taken a life before. Her heightened senses were suddenly overwhelmed by the metallic, coppery scent of fresh death in the air, but she forced her spine to remain perfectly straight. She did not drop the K. She did not fall to her knees. On the other side of the room, Darius stood up slowly. He dropped his massive broadsword. It hit the stone floor with a heavy, ringing clang that startled Keon, but Rowan didn't flinch. She heard the Alpha King's heavy boots crossing the room, navigating the wreckage and the bodies without hesitation. He didn't rush. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate reverence. Darius stopped directly in front of her. He looked at the dead assassin at her feet, then looked up at his fragile, blind mate. The amber of his eyes had almost entirely swallowed the whites, the primal wolf inside him pushing against the surface of his skin, absolutely mesmerized by the lethal, unbreakable creature standing before him. He reached out. He moved slowly, telegraphing his movements so she could hear the rustle of his leather armor, giving her time to brace herself. His massive, calloused hands gently gripped the wood of her cane, just above her white-knuckled fingers. He didn't pull it away by force. He waited until she exhaled a long, shaky breath and slowly uncurled her fingers, surrendering the weapon to him. He tossed the cane aside. Then, Darius framed her face with his hands. His thumbs gently, almost reverently, brushed a smudge of ash from her cheekbone. "You see the dark better than any of them," Darius whispered, his voice thick with a primal, possessive awe. It was not the voice of a Baochua talking to a servant. It was the voice of an alpha kneeling to his equal. The sheer, overwhelming adrenaline finally cracked Rowan's icy composure. Her bravado faltered, just for a second. She stepped forward, resting her forehead against the center of his chest, listening to the steady, unshakable rhythm of his massive heart. The scent of ozone and iron grounded her. "I told you," Rowan murmured, her voice trembling slightly, but she held it firm. "Your shadows do not frighten me." Darius wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her pale blonde hair, shielding her entirely from the cold wind of the storm. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of pine, earth, and the undeniable truth of the mate bond that now pulsed fiercely between them. "Keon," Darius commanded, his voice returning to its low, absolute authority without shifting his hold on Rowan. "My king," the Vanguard Beta replied, stepping forward, his voice completely stripped of its former hostility. "Find the captain of the guard," Darius ordered, his amber eyes opening, burning with a cold, terrifying promise of slaughter. "Tell him to secure the keep. No one leaves. No noble, no lord, no servant. Lock the gates. Tomorrow morning we do not hold a court session." Rowan lifted her head, her clouded eyes staring blankly at the Alpha King's chest. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Darius looked down at her, a dark, devastating smile curving his scarred lips. "Tomorrow," the king whispered, "the pack learns how to kneel." Morning in Ethgard usually smelled of baking bread, damp earth, and the sharp scent of the northern woods. Today, it smelled of absolute, paralyzing fear. The great hall was freezing. The massive hearths had not been lit. There were no expensive perfumes masking the air today, and no velvet dresses carefully arranged for display. The nobility of the north had been dragged from their beds by Keon and the royal guard at first light, forced to stand in the center of the cold stone floor in their sleepwear and hasty cloaks. At the base of the iron throne lay the bodies of the 4 assassins, wrapped in rough canvas. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall groaned open. The frantic, terrified whispers of the court died instantly. Rowan walked in first. She wore the same midnight blue wool dress from the banquet, though the hem was now faintly stained with ash. She held her black oak cane, the silver wolf's head gleaming in the pale morning light filtering through the high windows. Her posture was flawless. Her chin was up, her spine rigid, her clouded gray eyes staring straight ahead. Darius walked beside her. He did not wear his crown. He did not wear his heavy furs. He wore the battle-scarred leather armor from the night before, a dark physical reminder of the violence that had just occurred. Alpha King did not guide Rowan to a secondary chair. He walked her directly to the center of the dais, right in front of the iron throne. The silence in the room was deafening. Rowan could hear the erratic, hammering heartbeats of every lord and lady in the hall. She heard the soft, pathetic whimpers of Lady Genevieve hiding behind her father. "Last night," Darius announced, his low, gravelly voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with lethal calm. "Lord Corwin and 3 other high-born families paid a guild of assassins to infiltrate my private solar. They used Wolfsbane to blind my senses in the dark. They intended to slaughter my mate and cut my throat in the chaos." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Lord Corwin's knees buckled, but 2 royal guards hauled him upright by his arms, forcing him to face the king. "But the High Lords of Ethgard made a fatal miscalculation," Darius continued, turning his body slightly so he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Rowan. He was not shielding her. He was presenting her. "You thought she was a broken, useless thing," Darius said, his amber eyes sweeping over the pale faces of the nobility. "You thought her blindness made her weak. But when the lights went out, and the King of the North was left stumbling in the dark, it was the Omega who saw the truth. It was the Omega who commanded the room. And it was the Omega who shattered the spine of the assassin sent to kill her." The nobles stared at the tiny, fragile blonde girl in absolute horrified shock. They looked at the heavy black oak cane in her hand, suddenly realizing it was not a crutch. It was a weapon. "I cannot see your faces," Rowan said. Her voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the hall it carried perfectly. It was cold, steady, and unbreakable. She took a single step forward, bringing her to the very edge of the dais. "But I do not need my eyes to see exactly what you are," Rowan continued. She tapped the iron tip of her cane against the stone floor. Clack. "I hear your greed. I smell your cowardice. You draped yourselves in silk and offered empty vows of loyalty, but in the dark, you are nothing but frightened animals." She turned her clouded gaze perfectly toward Lord Corwin. The older man flinched as if he had been struck. "I survived 22 years in the shadows of this keep, Lord Corwin. Rowan whispered, her voice dropping into a register of pure steel. Do not mistake my caste for stupidity. If you plot against my king, I will hear it in your footsteps. I will smell it in your sweat, and I will end you before you even draw your blade. The absolute, terrifying certainty in her voice broke whatever resistance remained in the room. Lord Aldrich, the oldest and most pragmatic of the northern lords, stepped forward from the crowd. He did not look at Darius. He looked entirely at the blind girl standing at the edge of the dais. Slowly, heavily, the old lord fell to his knees on the freezing stone. He pressed his right fist over his heart and bowed his head, exposing his throat. Long live the Queen, Aldrich murmured. The words acted as a catalyst. One by one, the heavy velvet cloaks of the nobility swept against the stone floor. Lady Genevieve fell to her knees, weeping silently. The corrupt elders, the arrogant warriors, the wealthy lords, all of them collapsed to the ground in absolute, undeniable submission. Darius reached out. He gently took Rowan's free hand, weaving his calloused fingers through hers. The warmth of his skin grounded her, sending a jolt of pure, undeniable pack magic through her veins. The mate bond settled over them, heavy, permanent, and recognized by the entire kingdom. The true mating ceremony was finally complete. Not in silk, perfumes, or hollow lies, but in iron, truth, and the undeniable power of a girl who refused to fear the dark. A crown can be stolen, but a true bond cannot be buried forever. Which moment proved Rowan was the true Queen of Ethgard to you? If you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories about rejected mates, hidden truths, and queens rising from pain to claim their absolute dignity, subscribe and come back for our next story.